My parents abandoned me at baggage claim when I was 5. A stranger stepped in, and only after he died did I discover he was a hidden tycoon who left me $5. 5M. My parents returned to sue me for it. They smirked in court, until the bailiff announced, "All rise for the judge." When I was 5 years old, my parents left me behind at the baggage claim, and my life split in two from that moment on. A man I had never met stepped in and saved me, and I only found out after he passed away that he was secretly a wealthy tycoon who left me $5.5 million, which is when my biological parents suddenly showed back up and tried to take it from me in court. They sat there grinning like they'd already won until the bailiff called out for everyone to rise for the judge, and all I could think about was how the harsh fluorescent lights at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport had burned into my brain that hot afternoon back in August of 1998. I was just a little kid, standing at carousel number 7 with a beat-up stuffed rabbit squeezed under my arm, surrounded by towering piles of suitcases that weren't mine. My mother, Karen Dawson, told me to stay right there while she went to find the bathroom, and I believed her because that's what kids do. 3 hours passed before anyone came back for me, and it wasn't her. Airport security finally noticed me after a janitor reported a small child crying next to the unclaimed luggage. Officer Rebecca Collins knelt down, took my hand and softly asked where my parents were, and all I could say was that my mom told me to wait and that she said she'd be right back. Officer Collins spent nearly 45 minutes searching the terminal before she checked the parking exit logs, which showed a silver Honda Accord registered to Karen and Mark Dawson leaving the airport just 17 minutes after their flight from Phoenix landed. That's when it became clear they hadn't forgotten me. They'd planned it. Court records later showed they'd talked about abandoning me for weeks because my dad had lost his job, and my mom wanted to chase an acting dream in California, and a 5-year-old daughter didn't fit into the future they wanted. Their plan was simple and cruel. Leave me somewhere public, let the system scoop me up, and walk away free of a child they never really wanted. What they didn't plan on was Leonard Hale. Leonard was 72, just back from visiting his daughter in Arizona, and he couldn't ignore what he saw when Officer Collins tried to calm me down while I cried in confusion. Something in him stopped him from walking past, so he asked the officer what would happen to me, and when she explained the foster care process, he quietly said there had to be another way. He told her his wife had passed 2 years earlier, that his house felt empty, that his daughter lived across the country, and that he was a retired accountant with a clean record, a quiet home, and space in his life for a kid who needed one. It wasn't how things usually worked, but Leonard didn't hesitate, hiring a lawyer, submitting to background checks, opening his home for inspections and pushing through months of paperwork. After 3 months of temporary placement, he became my legal guardian, and within a year and a half, he officially adopted me. Leonard lived in a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet Dallas suburb, and nothing about him screamed money. He drove an old Buick, clipped coupons, bought generic groceries, and rotated the same 3 cardigans like they were uniforms. He taught me how to read using library books, made sure we ate dinner together every night at 6 sharp, and listened to me talk about my day like every detail mattered. He never tried to pretend my parents hadn't existed, and when I asked about them early on, he told me straight that they made a choice that hurt me and that it was on them, not me, and that I deserved better. I called him Grandpa Len, and he told people I was his second chance to get life right. School became the place where I felt safe, and Leonard never missed a conference, play, or science fair, sitting with me at the kitchen table night after night to help with homework, long division, and grammar rules. When I struggled to understand what I was reading in 2nd grade, he read with me every single night until it finally clicked, and by 4th grade I was reading years ahead of my class. He worked part-time consulting for small businesses, just enough to keep us comfortable, never flashy, and our vacations were simple trips to state parks, free museums, and birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes. He saved whatever he could for my college fund, dollar by dollar, and I never felt poor because I never once felt unloved. When I was 13, I finally asked him why he stopped that day at the airport, and we were sitting on the back porch watching fireflies blink to life as the sun went down. Leonard passed away 2 months after my 22nd birthday, and his daughter flew in from Seattle along with a small group of old coworkers and neighbors who all showed up to say goodbye. I gave the eulogy myself, and I barely held it together, my voice shaking the whole time as I tried not to completely fall apart in front of everyone. Afterward, Leonard's daughter wrapped her arms around me and quietly told me that he loved me deeply, and that I gave real meaning to the final years of his life. 2 days later, I got a call from Leonard's attorney, a man named Samuel Whitaker, who had handled the adoption paperwork years earlier and had also taken care of Leonard's will. He asked if I could come by his office that Friday afternoon, saying there were things we needed to discuss in person. His law office sat on the second floor of an old building in downtown Dallas, the kind with creaky stairs and worn brass railings. Mr. Whitaker was in his late 60s, with calm eyes behind thin wireframe glasses, and before we talked business, he offered me coffee and a couple of store-bought cookies. Once he settled behind a large oak desk, he looked at me carefully and said Leonard had been a very private man and that what he was about to share might come as a shock. He slid a thick folder across the desk, and inside were bank statements, property records, and investment summaries. The man who clipped coupons and drove an old Buick had built a net worth of roughly $18 million. I stared at the paperwork, my brain refusing to accept the numbers in front of me, convinced there had to be some kind of mistake. Mr. Whitaker explained that Leonard made his money in commercial real estate back in the 70s and 80s, buying properties before neighborhoods took off, selling at exactly the right time, and then reinvesting carefully. After his wife passed, Leonard intentionally scaled his life way down because he didn't care about possessions anymore, valuing people and experiences instead. My hand shook as I turned page after page showing properties across Dallas, Austin, and Houston, along with investment accounts, treasury bonds, and a carefully managed portfolio overseen by one of the most respected firms in Texas. I asked why he never told me any of this, barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitaker smiled and said Leonard wanted me to grow up normal, to understand hard work and responsibility, and to love him for who he was, not for what he had. He'd been burned before by people who only cared about his money and trusted very few people fully. Mr. Whitaker told me Leonard trusted me more than anyone else, which was why he left me $5.5 million and very specific instructions on how it was to be used. Hearing that number made the room feel like it was spinning, because at the time I was a broke college student working part-time at a campus bookstore and living off ramen several nights a week. Mr. Whitaker patiently walked me through everything, explaining that $2 million was placed in a trust one could use right away for school, housing, and emergencies, while the remaining $3.5 million would be released over time, $1 million at 25, another at 30, and the rest at 35. Leonard had included guidance encouraging me to keep learning, find work that mattered, and help others whenever I could. The rest of his estate was divided between charities and his daughter, and Mr. Whitaker said Leonard made sure everyone he cared about was taken care of, but that I had always been his top priority. He told me Leonard spent the last 15 years of his life planning to make sure my future was secure. I sat there crying for a long time while Mr. Whitaker quietly handed me tissues and didn't rush me once. When I finally calmed down, he gave me one last envelope and told me Leonard had written it for me to read after everything legal was settled. I didn't open it until I got back to my apartment, where I sat on my bed and unfolded 3 pages covered in Leonard's familiar handwriting. He wrote that if I was reading it, he was gone and I'd just learned he wasn't as broke as he pretended to be, and he hoped I could forgive an old man for that small deception. He said he wanted to give me something more important than money, a normal childhood where I was loved for who I was, not for what I might one day inherit. He reminded me that my biological parents, Karen and Mark Dawson, left me at that airport because they saw me as a burden, but he wanted me to understand deeply that I was never a burden to him, that I was a blessing and the greatest joy of his later years. He told me the money was mine to use wisely, that he trusted me because he'd watched me grow into a kind, thoughtful, and capable young adult. He encouraged me to finish school, build a fulfilling life, help people when I could, fall in love with someone who truly valued me, and create the family I deserved from the start. He ended by reminding me that I was always worthy of love, always enough, and always worth staying for, signing it with all his love. I kept that letter in my nightstand for years, pulling it out on the hard days to remind myself that someone had chosen me and stayed. Graduating from Texas State felt bittersweet without Leonard in the crowd, but I finished summa cum laude with a teaching degree because I wanted to honor him. I took a job teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school in a lower-income part of Dallas, something I could afford to do because Leonard's gift meant I didn't have to chase the highest paycheck. Teaching turned into more than a job, it became what I was meant to do. Especially working with kids who reminded me of myself, kids who just needed someone to believe in them. I used part of the inheritance to buy books, supplies, and resources my classroom otherwise wouldn't have had, made sure every kid was recognized on their birthday, helped cover lunches when needed, and made field trips possible. Parents called me Miss Anita, never knowing I could have lived anywhere I wanted, because I chose a simple apartment, a reliable used car, and a quiet life. Leonard had taught me that real wealth wasn't about showing off, but about what you could quietly do for others. I was 26 and finishing my 4th year of teaching when Karen and Mark Dawson found me, the same two people who had abandoned their 5-year-old daughter at an airport nearly 3 decades earlier before disappearing and trying to start over somewhere else. They'd gone on to have another child, a son born when I was 8, and they raised him while acting like I never existed, right up until the moment they heard Leonard had died and I'd inherited money. I'll probably never know how the news reached them, whether they quietly kept tabs on me over the years, spotted Leonard's obituary mentioning his adopted daughter, or even hired a private investigator once they suspected there was money involved. What I do know is that they showed up at my school on a Tuesday afternoon in April, turning my normal workday upside down. The principal called me to the office during my planning period, and when I walked in, I saw 2 people sitting in the waiting area who looked familiar but distant, like faces from a half-forgotten dream. My mother, Karen Dawson, was heavier and looked older than her 52 years, and my father, Mark Dawson, was balding, his face worn down by time and disappointment. My mother stood up with tears in her eyes and said my name like it was a miracle, and the principal glanced between us, clearly confused, before asking if I knew them. I told him calmly that they were my biological parents, the ones who left me at DFW when I was 5, and the room went painfully quiet. My mother winced, my father cleared his throat, and he asked if we could talk somewhere private. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop after school, mostly because I couldn't stop myself from wondering what they could possibly say after nearly 20 years of silence. That curiosity evaporated the moment they walked in with a lawyer, and right then I knew this had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with money. Their attorney, polished and confident in an expensive suit, explained their position like it was a business transaction, claiming that as my biological parents they were entitled to a portion of my inheritance. He talked about hard times, another child to support, medical bills, debt piling up, and then painted Leonard as a stranger who stole their daughter and poisoned her against them. According to them, they'd been young, scared, and struggling, but had never stopped loving me, and listening to that version of events made my blood boil. I told them quietly that they hadn't misplaced me or made a small error. They abandoned me next to a baggage carousel and drove away by choice. My mother begged me to understand, saying they were desperate and thought I'd be better off in the system, that someone else could give me more than they ever could. I told her someone had adopted me, and he gave me love, stability, and education, and yes, financial security, none of which had come from them. Their attorney jumped in, arguing that Texas law recognized parental rights, and that they could make a strong case they deserved compensation for being deprived of raising me. And I told him they weren't deprived of anything because they'd chosen to leave. My father tried a softer angle, saying they'd been young and made a mistake and asking if people didn't deserve second chances, and I looked at the 2 people who shared my DNA but had never shown up for my life and told them Leonard gave me everything they refused to, that he chose me every single day while they chose themselves. When their attorney said they were prepared to file a lawsuit but preferred to settle, I asked how much, and when he said $2 million would be fair, I stood up and told them I'd see them in court. 3 weeks later, they filed the lawsuit, Karen and Mark Dawson versus me, a case built around the idea that my biological parents were entitled to money from the man who actually raised me. Their legal strategy focused on parental alienation, accusing Leonard of unfairly turning me against them and stealing a role that should have been theirs, and I hired Veronica Chun, one of the most respected family law attorneys in Dallas, who wasn't intimidated by aggressive tactics. She told me during our first meeting that they didn't have much of a case, since their parental rights were terminated the moment Leonard adopted me, and they had no claim to his assets, but she also explained they were likely hoping I'd settle just to make the stress go away. I refused because my biological parents had given me nothing but trauma, while Leonard gave me everything, and protecting what he left behind felt like honoring him. The lawsuit spilled into every corner of my life, with my principal checking in on me, parents offering support after hearing about it on the news, and fellow teachers covering my classes and bringing me coffee when depositions left me exhausted. What hurt the most was the media attention. The way local stations turned my life into a dramatic headline about an abandoned child, a fortune, and a bitter family fight. Reporters called non-stop, showed up at my apartment, questioned neighbors, and aired interviews where my parents played the role of heartbroken victims separated from their daughter by a wealthy man with an agenda. I watched one of those interviews in Veronica's office, feeling sick as my mother dabbed at her eyes and talked about losing me. And when I said she sounded convincing, Veronica told me narcissists often rewrite history so thoroughly they come to believe their own lies. During discovery, details surfaced that I'd never known before, because my parents' legal team subpoenaed records from the day I was abandoned, hoping to dig up something that would tarnish Leonard's name. Instead, the documents showed airport security had handled the incident carefully, including a detailed report from Officer Mills noting that surveillance cameras had tracked my parents through the terminal, even though the footage itself had been destroyed years earlier under routine retention rules. Her report laid out exactly what happened, noting how my father kept checking his watch while my mother crouched down, spoke to me for a moment, pointed toward the baggage claim, and then walked away without ever looking back. According to the report, they moved fast through the terminal and never once turned around to see if I was still there. It also carefully documented Leonard's behavior, explaining that he had been sitting nearby waiting for a connecting flight when he noticed me standing alone, and that he waited nearly 20 minutes, clearly expecting a parent to return, before finally approaching Officer Mills to ask what was going on. Officer Mills wrote that his concern was immediate and sincere, not intrusive or opportunistic, and Veronica planned to use that documentation at trial if it came to that. As discovery continued, even more information surfaced that strengthened our position. My parents had left Phoenix buried in credit card debt and filed for bankruptcy 6 months after abandoning me, listing no dependents on the paperwork. When they later applied for government assistance in California, they again declared themselves childless, and every official document they filed for nearly 20 years showed only one child, my younger half-brother. They didn't just walk away from you physically, Veronica explained to me, they erased you completely, choosing over and over again to pretend you never existed, which showed this wasn't a desperate mistake but a long-term decision. My father's deposition made that painfully clear, because under oath he admitted they'd talked about leaving me at the airport for weeks before doing it, blaming the idea on my mother while admitting he went along with it because they didn't want another mouth to feed. When Veronica asked why they hadn't pursued legal options like formally surrendering me to child services, he couldn't give an answer and instead said they just needed a fresh start, like I was an old piece of furniture left on the curb. Emotionally, it wrecked me, reopening wounds I'd spent years working through in therapy as a teenager, therapy Leonard insisted on, because he understood that love didn't magically erase trauma. Old fears came roaring back, and I started having nightmares about airports, about being left behind, about waking up and realizing Leonard was gone again. My students noticed right away that something was wrong, because third graders pick up on things adults often miss, and one day a boy named Tyler, whose own dad had walked out on his family, handed me a drawing during recess. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow with the words "Family is who loves you" written in crayon, and he told me seriously that his mom said I was going through something hard, but that I'd taught them hard things don't last forever. I kept that drawing on my desk through the entire lawsuit, and on the worst days when my parents' attorney sent especially nasty letters or when the judge initially seemed sympathetic to their claims, I'd look at that rainbow and remember why I was fighting, not just for myself but for every kid who needed to know that real family chooses you every day. The case dragged on for 10 exhausting months filled with depositions, document requests, and mediation attempts that went nowhere, while my parents constantly played the role of victims, poor struggling parents who'd made one mistake and lost their child forever. They claimed they'd tried to find me but couldn't locate any records, and painted Leonard as a wealthy opportunist who took advantage of their temporary crisis, even though none of it was true. My mother cried during her deposition, talking about how much she missed me and how she thought about me every day, which might have sounded convincing if I hadn't already read documents proving they actively avoided being found after abandoning me. My father claimed he wanted to come back for me but blamed my mother for insisting it was better to let me go, and their stories never quite lined up. The trial was set for November, almost 2 years after Leonard's death, and Veronica prepared me thoroughly, reminding me that the law was clear. Leonard had legally adopted me, his assets were his to distribute, and my biological parents had no claim to any of it, even though the legal system doesn't always follow common sense. 3 weeks before trial, Veronica called with news I hadn't expected, telling me the judge assigned to our case was Margaret Hale. My heart dropped because she was Leonard's biological daughter, and Veronica confirmed she'd been a family court judge in Dallas County for 8 years. I asked what that meant, and Veronica explained my parents' attorney would immediately file for recusal, arguing she couldn't be impartial because she was Leonard's daughter and my legal sister, and whether it would be granted depended on the arguments and the judge's response. The motion was filed the next day, with their attorney claiming Judge Hale had a personal relationship with me and a financial interest in protecting Leonard's estate, while Veronica responded that Judge Hale had already received her inheritance independently, had no financial stake in mine, and was fully capable of remaining impartial. The recusal hearing happened 2 weeks before trial, with Judge Hale presiding over it herself as standard procedure, listening calmly to both sides before addressing my parents' attorney directly, and saying that he was arguing her relationship to the defendant created the appearance of bias. She stated for the record that Leonard Hale was her father and that he had legally adopted me, Anita Hale, but explained that she'd had very little contact with me growing up since she lived in Arizona while Leonard and I were in Texas, and that her father's estate had already been settled separately from this case. She made it clear she had no financial interest in the outcome at all, then paused to review her notes before saying that the issue before the court was strictly a legal one, whether the plaintiffs had any valid claim to assets distributed through a lawful adoption and a properly executed will. She said her personal feelings about her father didn't alter the legal standards she was obligated to apply, and when she looked up, she acknowledged that even the appearance of impropriety could undermine public trust in the judicial system. Addressing Mr. Harris directly, she explained that she was denying the motion for recusal and laying out her reasoning clearly for the record, adding that if her rulings during trial demonstrated actual bias rather than legal interpretation, that would be grounds for appeal, but she would not remove herself based on speculation. My parents' attorney looked irritated but had no choice except to accept it. The trial was held in the 68th District Court of Dallas County, an imposing downtown building that felt heavy with marble and authority, and I dressed carefully in a navy blazer, white blouse, and simple jewelry after Veronica coached me to project calm confidence. My parents arrived with their attorney and several people I didn't recognize, likely character witnesses, with my mother clutching a Bible in a conservative dress and my father wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, clearly coached on appearances as well. When the bailiff called for everyone to rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Hale, she entered in black robes with her silver hair neatly pinned back, 65 years old and Leonard's only biological child, and even after the recusal hearing, seeing her on the bench felt surreal. She reviewed the file, then announced the court would hear arguments in Dawson v. Dawson, inviting Mr. Harris to present his case, which turned into nearly 3 hours of him arguing that two people who abandoned their child somehow deserved money from the man who raised her. He leaned on emotional distress, loss of parental relationship, and financial hardship, painting my parents as victims of circumstance whose daughter had been taken by a wealthy stranger with advantages they lacked. Judge Hale listened without reacting, occasionally asking sharp questions that exposed the holes in his claims, pointing out that while my parents were never charged with abandonment, they cooperated by disappearing to California without leaving a forwarding address. When he argued they were young and overwhelmed, she calmly noted they were 24 and 26, old enough to be responsible for their decisions. He shifted to emotion, calling my mother to testify tearfully about regret and longing, claiming Leonard had blocked contact, though she couldn't explain why she'd never pursued official avenues, and Judge Hale's questions cut through the performance by asking whether she'd ever filed to regain custody or consulted an attorney. My mother struggled, finally saying she thought it was better for me and believed I was happy, until the judge pointed out the lawsuit only appeared after my inheritance, leaving the courtroom silent. When Veronica stood, she dismantled their case piece by piece, presenting the airport abandonment reports, emergency custody records, Leonard's meticulous documentation of my schooling, medical care, and daily life, and proof of his steady investment in my education. When I testified, I spoke about Leonard's love, his steady presence, his choice to live simply while making sure I had everything I needed, and how he taught me hard work, compassion, and the value of education. I explained the letter he left and why he kept his wealth private, and when Veronica asked if he'd ever spoken badly about my biological parents, I said no, that he was honest about their choice without poisoning me against them and always focused on building our life together. I told the court he would have supported me if I'd wanted to find them, but I chose not to because they abandoned me and Leonard chose me, making him my father in every way that mattered. When my parents' attorney tried to suggest Leonard manipulated my memories, Judge Hale shut it down immediately, stating that I was 5 years old when it happened and remembered it because it was traumatic, not because anyone put ideas in my head. The trial wrapped up late on the second day, and Judge Hale announced she would review all the evidence and issue her decision within 2 weeks before formally adjourning the court. As people filtered out into the hallway, my mother tried to come toward me, but Veronica stepped in smoothly and told her she should speak to her attorney about appropriate contact. My mother looked at me with desperation in her eyes and said my name, insisting we were family, and I answered quietly that we weren't, because family shows up and family stays, and they were strangers who only shared my DNA. 12 days later, the ruling came down, and Veronica called me at school during lunch, barely able to contain herself, telling me I needed to sit down before she said another word. Judge Hale's decision was 32 pages long and absolutely brutal, systematically dismantling every argument my parents had made and finding each one completely without merit. She cited Texas law on adoption, the termination of parental rights, and estate distribution, referencing decades of case precedent, but the most powerful portion of the ruling was deeply personal. She wrote about Leonard's character, his careful and intentional decision to adopt me, and his unwavering commitment to giving a traumatized child a stable and loving home, noting that he could have simply reported my abandonment and walked away, but instead chose responsibility and compassion. In her conclusion, she addressed my parents directly, stating that their claim they were deprived of a parental relationship by Leonard's actions was disingenuous at best and fraudulent at worst, because they deprived themselves of that relationship the moment they chose to abandon their 5-year-old daughter in a public place and flee the state, and no court could restore what they had willingly surrendered. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again, and Judge Hale ordered my parents to pay my legal fees, which totaled more than $120,000, calling the lawsuit frivolous and clearly motivated by financial gain. My parents appealed the decision and that appeal was denied, then tried to take it even higher only to be denied again, and nearly 2 years after they first walked into my school, the legal fight finally ended for good. I never heard from them again. Life moved forward. I kept teaching and continued using my resources to support students who needed extra help, and I established a scholarship fund in Leonard's name for kids from hard backgrounds who showed academic promise and strong character. The first recipient was a girl named Ashley, whose mother was incarcerated and whose grandmother was raising her on disability income, and by the time I turned 30, Ashley had finished community college and was working toward a degree in social work. I met my husband when I was 29, a middle school science teacher named Daniel who was kind, patient and funny, with a deep commitment to his students and a shared belief that education could change lives. I told him about Leonard on our third date because I wanted him to understand who I was and where I came from, and he said Leonard sounded like an incredible man, and I told him Leonard had been my whole world for 16 years and that I was grateful every day he found me at that airport and decided I was worth staying for. Daniel proposed a year later at the Dallas Arboretum, Leonard's favorite place, where we'd scattered his ashes beneath the oak tree where he used to read to me on Saturday afternoons. We married in a small ceremony with close friends and a retired family court judge officiating, because Judge Margaret Hale had retired the year before and become a cherished part of my life, the sister I never really grew up with but who shared my love for the man who saved me. At the reception, Margaret told me her father would be incredibly proud of me, and that I'd become exactly who he hoped I would. I'm 34 now, and Daniel and I have 2 daughters, Grace who is 6 and Lucy who is 3, and we live in the same quiet Dallas suburb where Leonard raised me, just a few streets from his old house. My girls visit Papa Leonard's oak tree often, where I tell them stories about the man who taught me that family isn't about biology but about choice. I still teach 3rd grade, and next year when I turn 35, I'll receive the final portion of my inheritance, which Daniel and I plan to use to open a learning center for at-risk kids. A place where children like I once was can find tutoring, safety, and adults who believe in them. Sometimes I think about my biological parents, Karen and Mark Dawson, and I don't hate them anymore because what I feel now is pity for what they missed, for the chance to know me and watch me grow into the person Leonard helped shape. They chose money over connection and greed over grace, showed up demanding what they never earned, and walked away with nothing but debt and the knowledge that their daughter built a full and beautiful life without them. Leonard always told me the best revenge was living well, and he was right as he was about most things. I don't need revenge, because their real punishment is knowing they threw away something precious that someone else treasured. Every night I tuck my daughters into bed and tell them I love them, making sure they know they are wanted, valued, and worth staying for. And I show them through my actions what Leonard showed me, that choosing someone every single day is what makes you family. Last week, Grace asked about the man in the photo on my nightstand, the old picture of Leonard holding 5-year-old me at the zoo, and I told her that was Papa Leonard, my daddy and the best person I ever knew. When she asked where he was now, I told her he was gone but left me something more valuable than anything else in the world. And when she asked what it was, I told her he left me knowing I was worth loving, and that it was a gift I would give to her and her sister every day of my life. She thought about that carefully, the way 6-year-olds do, and asked if my first parents loved me, and I told her honestly I didn't think they knew how, but Papa Leonard loved me enough for everyone, and she wrapped her arms around me tight. "I'm glad Papa Leonard found you," she said, and I smiled and told her I was too, really and truly. On the hard days when teaching feels like too much or being a parent feels overwhelming, I still take out Leonard's letter and read the words he wrote all those years ago. The paper is soft and worn now, creased from being unfolded so many times, but the meaning hasn't faded at all. I was always worthy of love. I was always enough. I was always worth staying for. A stranger in an airport showed that to a terrified 5-year-old kid, and I've spent my adult life passing that truth on to others. That's the inheritance that matters most to me, not the money or the financial safety, but the unshakable certainty that I was chosen, that someone saw me and decided I was worth everything. My biological parents came back demanding payment for DNA, but real parenthood has nothing to do with biology. It's about showing up, staying put, and choosing someone every single day, even when it's inconvenient or hard. Leonard Hale taught me that lesson at baggage claim carousel number 7 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on an August afternoon in 1998, and he kept teaching it until the day he died. That's the real win here, not the courtroom ruling or the dismissed lawsuit, but the life I built on the foundation Leonard gave me. My parents thought they could swoop back in and claim something they'd never earned, and instead they walked away with exactly what they deserved, nothing. I walked away with everything that actually matters: love, family, purpose, and the knowledge that Leonard's choice to step in that day changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone I go on to teach, help, and love. The best revenge really is living well, and Leonard understood that just like Judge Hale did, and now my daughters do too. Some families are formed by birth and some are formed by choice, and Leonard chose me when I needed someone most. That's a story worth telling, a legacy worth honoring, and an inheritance no lawsuit could ever touch. That certainty shaped every decision I made afterward. Not anger, not fear, not revenge, just the quiet knowledge that I had been chosen when it mattered most. Leonard Hale saw a scared 5-year-old standing alone at baggage claim carousel number 7 and decided she was worth the effort, the paperwork, the patience, and the love, choosing to step forward when 2 people chose to walk away. That one decision echoed through every year of my life. My biological parents believed they could come back decades later and collect a reward for genetics alone, thinking blood entitled them to something they never earned, but what they learned instead was that the law, like life, values actions over excuses and choices over intentions. Leonard chose me, and because of that choice I built a life grounded in stability, compassion, and purpose. A family that shows up, a classroom where kids know they matter, and a future where abandonment didn't get the final word. I don't carry bitterness anymore. I carry gratitude. Gratitude for the man who became my father, gratitude for a judge who chose truth over manipulation, and gratitude for the kids I teach who remind me every day why choosing someone matters. Leonard used to say love isn't proven by what you claim, but by what you do when no one is watching, and he lived that belief quietly and consistently without needing applause. Even now, long after he's gone, his actions are still speaking every time I comfort a scared student, every time I stand up for a child who feels invisible, and every time I tell my daughters they are wanted, valued, and worth staying for. That is Leonard's legacy, not the money, not the properties, not the court victory, but the power of choice, because a stranger chose me once, and I choose others every single day.